Before any empire falls, before any crisis becomes visible, even before chaos receives a name, something silently changes in the human mind, and it is precisely there that Hermes Trismegistus begins his reading of time. Not with dates, not with spectacular predictions, but with an uncomfortable question. What if the time you believe you are living in is not advancing, but closing in? Hermes never spoke of time as a line running from the past to the future. For him, time is a movement of the universal mind, a pulse. Everything that exists vibrates, returns, reorganizes itself. Civilizations, cultures, values, and even the perception of reality follow this same invisible rhythm. Nothing arises by chance. Nothing collapses suddenly. Everything obeys the same laws that govern the stars, natural cycles, and consciousness itself. What makes this vision unsettling is not what it says about the past, but what it suggests about the present. If time is cyclical, then infinite progress is a comfortable illusion. If everything returns, then each peak silently carries the germ of its own dissolution. Hermes observed that all expansion, when it loses awareness of its own laws, transforms into excess, and all excess generates imbalance, not as punishment but as a consequence. Here comes the first discomfort. If human history is not an ascending line, but a repetition of mental patterns, then perhaps we are less advanced than we imagine. Perhaps we are simply repeating on a different scale the same cycle that other civilizations have already experienced. The same initial enthusiasm, the same confidence in control, the same belief that this time it will be different. Hermes didn't call it an error, he called it forgetfulness, the forgetfulness of universal laws. The forgetfulness that external reality is always a reflection of the internal state of the collective mind. By the law of correspondence, what is organized within manifests without. When the mind is aligned, the world is structured. When the mind is fragmented, the world reflects that fragmentation. And here arises a question that is not usually asked. What happens when a civilization reaches the maximum of information, but the minimum of understanding? Hermes warned that the accumulation of data does not elevate consciousness. On the contrary, when the mind is overwhelmed by stimuli, it loses depth. When everything demands attention, nothing is truly understood. Excess does not illuminate, it confuses. This confusion doesn't arise overnight. It creeps in slowly. First as constant distraction, then as an inability to be silent, next as a loss of meaning. The human being continues functioning, producing, moving, but no longer knows exactly why. Hermes saw this as a clear sign of a change of cycle. When the mind stops asking about meaning and only reacts to impulses, at this point time begins to behave strangely. People feel that everything is speeding up, but at the same time it seems empty. Days pass quickly, years disappear, and yet the inner feeling is one of stagnation. For Hermeticism, this is not just psychological, it is vibrational. According to the law of vibration, when consciousness becomes misaligned, time is perceived as pressure, not as flow. Hermes asserted that time does not oppress anyone by chance. It merely reveals the state of mind that traverses it. An ordered mind perceives time as an ally. A fragmented mind feels it as a threat. And when this fragmentation ceases to be individual and becomes collective, the cycle begins to close. Here arises another silent conflict. If everything begins in the mind, then wars, economic crises, and social collapses are not causes, but effects. They are belated echoes of something that has already broken down internally. Before the external fall, there is a fall of meaning. Before the visible collapse, there is a loss of inner direction. Hermes insisted on this. No one destroys a world without first destroying the meaning that sustains it. Perhaps that's why her interpretation of time is so unsettling. She doesn't point fingers at external culprits. She doesn't blame specific events. She returns the responsibility to human consciousness. If the cycle changes, it's not because invisible forces are conspiring, but because the collective mind vibrates at a different frequency, and frequency doesn't lie. It only expresses what is repeatedly sustained. The question that begins to form, even if no one wants to verbalize it, is inevitable. What if the signs described by Hermes are not warnings of something to come, but precise descriptions of what is already happening? What if the cycle isn't starting tomorrow, nor in some spectacular future event, but is already in silent motion now, while everything seems normal? Hermes never spoke of a sudden end. He spoke of a gradual closure, a period in which humanity continues to advance technically, but regresses internally. A time when we know more and more about the external world, but less and less about ourselves. And when this imbalance persists, reality itself begins to press for correction. None of this is presented as an inevitable tragedy. Hermes didn't work with fear, but with understanding. Even so, understanding this initial point in the cycle is unsettling, because it forces us to abandon the comfortable idea that time is always on our side. Perhaps time simply reveals who we truly are. If this is true, then the central question is not when the cycle ends, but when we realize that it is already in motion. Because only those who stop looking only outward and begin to observe what is happening within the collective human mind recognize the cycle. But if time really works this way, if everything begins in the mind and is reflected in the world, then there is a more precise map to identify this stage of the cycle. A map that is not in calendars or popular predictions, but in the very universal laws that Hermes described. And it is precisely this map that begins to reveal itself from here on. Hermes Trismegistus never described humanity's destiny as a sequence of random events. For him, the visible world was always merely the last link in an invisible chain. Before any external event, there is an internal state that prepares it. Before any historical era, there is a mental vibration that sustains it. That is why, when speaking of cycles, Hermes did not offer dates, but a map that is not read with the eyes, but with consciousness. This map originates from the law of correspondence. What happens on the mental plane is reflected on the material plane. What is repeated within the human mind ends up solidifying in reality, not as punishment but as a consequence. Hermes observed that entire civilizations function as enlarged individuals. They think, desire, fear, and react collectively. And precisely for this reason, they also become ill collectively. To understand this point, one only needs to look at common everyday situations. A person who constantly lives in a state of tension begins to perceive the world as hostile. Small problems seem like enormous threats. The body reacts, health deteriorates, relationships become difficult. None of this happens suddenly. It is the mind that, sustaining an internal pattern, reorganizes all external experience. Hermes simply extended this logic to entire societies. When a civilization sustains, for long enough, an internal state of fear, excessive competition, and disconnection, the world around it begins to reflect this. The economy becomes unstable. Relationships become superficial. The future ceases to be perceived as a construct and begins to be seen as a threat, not because something went wrong, but because the collective vibration has changed. Hermes called this reading the times. It's not about predicting what will happen, but about observing what is already being sustained internally. If a society values only speed, production, and constant stimulation, it inevitably becomes saturated. Excess does not create true expansion. It creates wear and tear, and all wear and tear requires correction. Here's a point that often surprises. Hermes didn't see collapse as an external event, but as a natural adjustment of universal laws. According to the law of cause and effect, nothing can remain in imbalance indefinitely. If one force grows unconsciously, another arises to compensate. This applies to individuals, relationships, and entire civilizations. Notice how this manifests in everyday life. People who live in constant hyperstimulation report a feeling of emptiness, even when surrounded by options. The more access they have, the less satisfied they feel. Hermes would say, this is the perfect correspondence between mind and reality. A fragmented mind creates a fragmented reality. An accelerated mind creates oppressive time. None of this is a coincidence. The Hermetic map of cycles shows that every civilization goes through similar phases. First, a strong central idea organizes the collective mind. Then this idea generates expansion, innovation, and growth. Next, the focus is lost. Form becomes more important than meaning. The means replace the purpose. When this happens, the vibration silently changes. This is the point where most people don't understand anything. Everything seems to work. The structures are still standing. Technology advances. The numbers grow. But internally, something begins to empty out. Hermes warned that this is the most dangerous stage because the collapse is not yet visible, but it is already inevitable if consciousness does not realign itself. To illustrate this, consider a personal relationship that starts well. There is purpose, connection, and presence. Over time, if attention is lost, the relationship may continue to exist formally, but without vitality. Conversations become automatic. Spending time together becomes a habit. When the breakup happens, it seems sudden, but in reality, The bond had already dissolved long before. The visible end is merely the final act. Hermes claimed that the same thing happens with civilizations. When the connection with universal laws weakens, something essential is lost. The collective mind continues to repeat old patterns, but without awareness of why. Reality begins to respond with subtle signs: generalized anxiety, a constant sense of urgency, loss of meaning, and increased internal conflicts. These signs are not punishments, they are messages. According to the law of correspondence, external reality attempts to reflect what the mind refuses to observe. The more consciousness ignores, the more intense the signs become. Not to destroy, but to force a readjustment. Here arises one of the most difficult ideas to accept. Hermes taught that no one is surprised by a cycle. The cycle only reveals itself to those who learn to read the patterns. The problem is that most people only observe the final effects and ignore the silent causes. When the world begins to seem unstable, the collective mind has already been unstable for a long time. Perhaps that's why so many people today feel that something is out of place, even without being able to explain exactly what. It's not just politics, economics, or technology. It's a diffuse feeling of disconnection. Hermes would say that this is the intuitive perception of a change of cycle, an internal recognition that the vibration that sustained reality is running out. And the more this feeling is stifled by distractions, the more intense it becomes. The Hermetic map shows that denying the cycle doesn't stop it. It only makes it more abrupt when it finally manifests. Collective consciousness always has a chance to adjust, but that chance diminishes as the forgetting of universal laws deepens. Here arises the inevitable suspense. If a map exists, if the cycles follow clear laws, then it is possible to identify when a specific stage is active, not through mystical predictions, but through direct observation of the human mind in action. The way people think, relate, consume, and react reveals more about the time in which they live than any calendar. Hermes made it clear that the final cycle does not begin with visible destruction, but with an internal reversal. When humankind begins to serve that which it has created, when the mind loses control over its own instruments, when the external begins to completely define the internal. This is the clearest sign that the cycle has entered its decisive phase. But recognizing the map is only the first step. The real question begins to take shape now. If these patterns are real, if they are active, then what specific signs indicate that this cycle is not just another one, but the final stage of a long repetition? That's exactly what begins to unfold next. Hermes Trismegistus described the final cycle not as a spectacular event, but as a prolonged state of the human mind, a stage in which consciousness loses its central position and begins to orbit that which it itself created. At this point in the cycle, the human being no longer governs its instruments. It responds to them. Thought ceases to be origin and becomes reaction. For Hermeticism, this is the clearest sign that the cycle has entered its decisive phase. What makes this stage different from previous ones is the intensity. In past cycles, the disconnection was localized, restricted to elites, empires, or specific regions. In the final cycle, the fragmentation becomes global. The same mental confusion, the same impulses, and the same voids appear in different cultures, different languages, different systems. Hermes would say that this occurs because the vibration is no longer local, but collective on a planetary scale. And here arises the first break in the pattern. If the final cycle is defined by a state of consciousness, how can it be recognized without depending on dates, prophecies, or external events? Hermes' answer always pointed inward. He taught that the final cycle begins when the human mind loses the ability to remain silent. Not just external silence, but inner silence. When thought becomes compulsive, when attention cannot focus, when the individual needs constant stimulation to avoid facing their own emptiness, consciousness has already entered a critical stage. This point is profound because it doesn't depend on specific technology, but it intensifies with it. Hermes wasn't talking about machines, but about the inversion between creator and creation. When that which should serve begins to command, the mind weakens. Human beings begin to measure their worth by external responses, validations, numbers, reactions. Identity ceases to be internal and becomes constructed externally. Observe how this manifests in daily life. People feel anxiety for no clear reason, difficulty concentrating, a constant feeling of urgency, even when nothing urgent is happening. Hermes would call this a mind displaced from its axis. According to the law of vibration, when the inner center is lost, everything around it seems unstable. And here comes another uncomfortable question. If the end cycle is a collective mental state, why does it seem so normal to those who live within it? Because, according to Hermes, consciousness adapts quickly to imbalance when it becomes the norm. What should sound like a warning begins to be interpreted as routine. Tiredness becomes identity. Haste becomes virtue. Superficiality becomes efficiency. The cycle doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It settles in as a habit. Hermes described this stage as the dominance of quantity over quality. More information, less wisdom. More connection, less real bond. More speed, less direction. Not out of malice, but out of forgetfulness of universal laws. When the mind turns away from the cause, it begins to live only in the effects. Here a silent rupture occurs. The law of cause and effect continues to operate, but consciousness no longer recognizes it. People react to consequences without understanding their origins. They try to correct the external world without reorganizing the internal world. Hermes saw this as the futile effort of pushing shadows without adjusting the light. But how do we differentiate this final stage from other difficult periods in history? The answer lies in the scope and depth. In previous cycles, crises were followed by clear reconstructions, guided by new collective meanings. In the final cycle, there is difficulty in creating new meanings. There is much movement, but little direction. Many narratives, but no shared truth. Hermes asserted that this is the point where the collective mind fragments into multiple versions of reality. This phenomenon generates a curious effect. The more options there are, the more confusion sets in. The more voices speak, the less clarity is achieved. Human beings begin to distrust everything, including themselves. Intuition weakens. The excess of stimuli blocks deep perception, and when perception is lost, consciousness enters defensive mode. And here another narrative twist emerges. What if the widespread fear that spreads silently is not caused by external threats, but by the loss of internal reference points? Hermes taught that fear arises when the mind no longer recognizes its origin. When the individual sees himself separated from universal laws, he feels at the mercy of chance. The final cycle intensifies this feeling because it breaks the invisible bonds that gave stability to consciousness. It is not the world that becomes more dangerous. It is the mind that becomes less centered. This stage is also marked by a reversal of values. The immediate becomes more important than the essential. Comfort replaces truth. Usefulness surpasses significance. Hermes did not condemn this morally. He merely pointed it out as a clear sign of a cycle closing. When the mind loses touch with principles, it clings to stimuli. A simple example helps to understand. Imagine someone who feeds only on sugar. At first there is pleasure and quick energy. Over time the body collapses, not because of any evil in the sugar, but because of a lack of balance. Hermes saw consciousness in the same way. When it feeds only on quick stimuli, it loses structural strength. At this point in the cycle, desperate attempts at control emerge. More rules, more surveillance, more pressure. But none of this solves the problem because the cause is not external. It lies in internal misalignment. According to the law of correspondence, the more external control is imposed, the more internal disorder is revealed. The cycle accelerates. And here comes the most unsettling question yet. If this is the final cycle, can it be interrupted? Hermes didn't speak of interruption, but of transition. The final cycle is not a punishment, but a limit. A point where consciousness can no longer expand in the same way. It either rises or dissolves. There is no prolonged middle ground. Reality begins to press towards a decision. This pressure manifests as multiple, overlapping, and seemingly disconnected crises. Hermes explained that this occurs when the collective mind can no longer sustain coherence. Every area of reality reflects internal fragmentation, relationships, work, identity, purpose. Everything seems unstable at the same time, but still, something essential remains hidden from most. The final cycle doesn't happen the same way for everyone. It manifests differently according to the individual's level of consciousness. For some, it's just suffering and confusion. For others, it's a silent calling. And here is the narrative twist that changes everything. Hermes stated that the final cycle does not destroy awakened consciousness. It merely removes what can no longer be sustained. What falls is not the human being, but the illusions they have built up throughout the cycle. This means that recognizing the stage of the cycle is not a reason for fear, but for clarity, because only those who perceive the closure have the chance to go through it consciously. The cycle doesn't call for despair, it calls for alignment. But how can we know if this alignment is still possible in such a saturated environment The answer lies not in the collective, nor in external systems. It lies in the individual transmutation of consciousness. And that is precisely what begins to emerge when we understand why this cycle is not just another one in the long repetition of human history. What follows reveals why, according to Hermes, this cycle can no longer be ignored, and why it demands a different response than all previous ones. Hermes Trismegistus asserted that no cycle announces itself with clear noises. It reveals itself through indirect signs, almost always ignored by those immersed in them. The final cycle, according to this interpretation, does not begin with a visible collapse, but with a silent change in the way the human mind perceives reality. People continue living, working and planning, but something essential no longer sustains these actions. Meaning dissolves before the structure falls. One of the clearest signs of this stage is the diffuse feeling of collective exhaustion. Never before has there been so much access to comfort, information and technology, and yet the perception of profound fatigue is growing. It's not just physical, it's mental. Recent studies show a steady increase in anxiety, depression, and feelings of emptiness across different age groups, including among young people who theoretically have everything in their favor. For Hermes, this data would not be surprising. He taught that when the mind deviates from universal laws, it loses vital energy, even when surrounded by resources. In everyday life, this manifests itself simply. People wake up already tired. They need constant stimulation to stay alert. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Moments of pause generate restlessness, not rest. Hermes would interpret this as a clear sign that the collective mental vibration has become unbalanced. According to the law of vibration, when the mind is artificially accelerated, time begins to be perceived as pressure, not as a natural flow. There's a curious story that illustrates this point well. In large urban centers, research shows that many people feel more stress during their time off than during work. Without external tasks, they come into contact with an inner emptiness that they avoid during their routine. Hermes would say that this reveals a profound displacement. The human being begins to use movement as an escape from himself. When stopping hurts, something is already out of order. Another important sign of the ongoing cycle is the fragmentation of attention. It has never been so difficult to maintain deep focus. Data indicates that the average time of continuous concentration has fallen drastically in recent decades. For Hermeticism, this is not just a technological effect, but a reflection of the saturated collective mind. When consciousness loses its center, it jumps from stimulus to stimulus seeking stability, but finds only more dispersion. Hermes taught that the human mind needs a central axis. Without it, everything becomes reaction. And a reactive society doesn't build, it only responds. It responds to crises, to news, to impulses. It lives putting out fires, but rarely questions the origin of the fire. This collective behavior is typical of closing cycles when the cause has already been forgotten and only the effects are perceived. An unexpected fact reinforces this interpretation. Even with scientific and material advancements, the feeling of a lack of purpose is growing. Research indicates that a significant portion of people do not see clear meaning in what they do daily. They fulfill functions, but do not feel connected to them. Hermes would call this a rupture between action and meaning. When doing becomes separated from being, the cycle begins to demand correction. This correction doesn't come as a gentle response. It appears as growing discomfort. Reality begins to pressure consciousness to reorganize itself. Overlapping crises, rapid changes, constant instability are not isolated accidents. They are external manifestations of a collective mind that has lost internal coherence. By the law of correspondence, the world merely reflects the state that sustains it. There is also a historical fact that often goes unnoticed. Declining civilizations almost always believed they were at their peak. The signs of collapse are rarely recognized while they are happening. They only become obvious afterward. Hermes warned of this when he stated that the greatest danger of a final cycle is its appearance of normality. Everything still works, but it no longer makes sense. Observe how this strange normality manifests itself today. People accept high levels of stress as something natural. Emotional instability becomes commonplace. Haste becomes the norm. Overstimulation is treated as inevitable. Hermes would see this as a collective state of adaptation to imbalance. Consciousness molds itself to the problem instead of solving it. Another unsettling point is the inversion between means and ends. Tools created to make life easier end up dominating it. Systems that should serve consciousness begin to shape behavior, rhythm, and values. Hermes described this as the loss of inner control. When human beings cease to consciously decide how they live, the cycle enters an advanced stage. There are contemporary accounts that clearly reflect this. People feel guilty for resting, anxiety for not being productive, constant fear of falling behind. Even without a real threat, the mind operates in a state of alert. Hermes would explain this phenomenon as a direct consequence of the law of cause and effect. A mind that deviates from balance creates realities that reinforce its own tension. And perhaps the most revealing sign is this. There is a growing feeling that something needs to change, but few know exactly what. There is a diffuse desire for transformation, accompanied by confusion. Hermes claimed that this is the moment when the cycle becomes conscious for some. When reality begins to seem artificial, excessive, or empty, the mind begins to question the pattern that sustains it all. This question is rare but powerful. It marks the point where the cycle ceases to be merely experienced and begins to be observed. Hermes taught that observation is already an act of separation. Whoever observes the cycle is not completely bound to it, and that is precisely why the final cycle does not affect everyone in the same way. While most try to restore lost comfort by repeating the same patterns, a minority begins to realize that discomfort is not the problem, it is the signal, a silent invitation to reorganize consciousness. The cycle presses, not to destroy, but to force a choice. External reality will remain unstable as long as the collective mind remains misaligned. But Hermes made it clear that alignment never begins in the collective, it begins in the individual. And it is at this point that the final cycle reveals its true nature. It is not merely a closure, but a threshold. The question that is beginning to emerge now is inevitable. If the cycle is already manifesting in the world, if the signs are clear in daily life, then there is a different way to navigate it, a way that does not involve blind resistance or denial, but conscious transformation. It is precisely this possibility that begins to emerge when we understand that collapse is not the end of the road, but the beginning of another stage in human consciousness. Hermes Trismegistus never treated collapse as a failure of humanity, but as an inevitable corrective mechanism. For him, when a way of life is exhausted, reality does not destroy it out of cruelty, but out of necessity. What can no longer sustain equilibrium needs to be dissolved so that something more coherent can emerge. It is at this point that the central idea which few understand comes in. Transmutation is not escaping collapse, it is consciously traversing it. The human mind resists this idea because it has been trained to fear loss. Everything that falls apart seems like a threat. But Hermes taught that nothing essential can be lost. Only forms, only structures, only artificial identities built up over the course of the cycle. Collapse doesn't remove what is real, it removes what is unsustainable. This distinction changes everything. When a person loses a social role, a routine, an old certainty, they feel as if they are losing themselves. But in the Hermetic view, this happens because they have confused essence with form. The final cycle presses precisely on this point. It forces the separation between what the human being is and what they believe themselves to be. In everyday life, this transformation begins uncomfortably. Old sources of pleasure cease to satisfy. Goals that once seemed clear lose their meaning. There is a feeling of emptiness that cannot be filled with more stimulation, more consumption, or more distraction. Hermes saw this emptiness not as a flaw, but as space. A space that arises when consciousness ceases to be fed by repeated illusions. Most people try to fill this void immediately. They seek new narratives, new identities, new distractions, but this only delays the process. True transmutation requires remaining in discomfort long enough for the mind to reorganize itself. According to the law of vibration, only that which is sustained internally can transform. Escaping the void keeps the old vibration active. Hermes explained that all transmutation begins in the mind, not in the external world. When the mind changes its frequency, reality responds. This is the difference between destructive collapse and initiatory collapse. For those who resist, the cycle seems overwhelming. For those who understand, it becomes a portal. There are ancient and modern accounts that illustrate this point. People who have experienced profound losses often report that, after the initial suffering, something essential reorganized itself within them, an unexpected clarity, a new simplicity, a more direct connection with what truly matters. Hermes would say that these people were not broken, they were purified. Transmutation does not eliminate pain, it gives it meaning. In the final cycle, pain intensifies not because the world has become more cruel, but because consciousness is being pressured to abandon obsolete structures. The greater the attachment to the old form, the greater the suffering. The greater the understanding of universal laws, the more fluid the process becomes. This point is crucial. Hermes never promised comfort during the transition. He promised coherence. Coherence between mind, cause, and effect. Whoever understands this stops fighting against the signs and begins to read them. Each crisis is then interpreted as a message, not as punishment. Transmutation also redefines the concept of power. In previous cycles, power was linked to external control. In the final cycle, the only real power is internal, the ability to maintain clarity amidst chaos, to not allow oneself to be fragmented by overload, to not surrender one's own consciousness to systems that thrive on distraction. This change is silent. It doesn't generate applause. It doesn't create immediate status, but it profoundly alters how the cycle is experienced. Hermes stated that two individuals can go through the same external collapse and live completely different experiences. One falls into despair, the other enters into lucidity. The difference is not in the event, but in the internal state. Here emerges a little discussed aspect. Transmutation is not a synchronized collective process. It happens at different paces. While the majority reacts, a minority begins to withdraw emotionally from the turmoil, not in the sense of physical isolation, but of non-identification. They observe, understand, and adjust. This minority has always existed in previous cycles, but in the final cycle, its role becomes decisive. Hermes saw these people as points of stabilization. When individual consciousness aligns with universal laws, it emits a different vibration. This vibration doesn't change the world immediately, but it alters how reality is organized around that individual. They cease to be dragged along by the cycle and begin to traverse it. Transmutation also requires detachment from the need for control. The final cycle reveals the limit of external intervention. The more one tries to force artificial stability, the more unstable everything becomes. Hermes taught that accepting transition is not passivity, but intelligence. It is recognizing when one form has ended and allowing another to emerge. This recognition brings a strange calm, not a naive calm, but a lucid serenity. The mind stops fighting against the inevitable and begins to work with it. By the law of cause and effect, this internal change profoundly alters external experience. The cycle continues, but it does not dominate. Perhaps that's why the final cycle is so misunderstood. It offers no easy solutions or external promises. It demands inner responsibility. It requires each individual to decide whether to continue feeding patterns that have already proven empty or to allow a profound reorganization of consciousness. Hermes never presented transmutation as something mystical or distant. He saw it as a daily practice, silencing when everything demands reaction, observing when everything calls for judgment, reducing when everything encourages excess. These small acts alter the internal frequency and over time completely change how the cycle is experienced. Collapse then ceases to be a threat and becomes a filter. What is superficial falls away. What is essential remains. The cycle doesn't ask if we are ready. It simply happens. But how we navigate it defines whether we emerge fragmented or integrated. And this is where the narrative reaches a crucial point. If transmutation is possible, if it depends on individual consciousness, then an inevitable question arises. What exactly is the role of the individual when everything around them seems to fall into disarray? The answer lies not in systems, ideologies, or external promises. It lies in the internal position each person chooses to occupy within the cycle, and that is precisely what needs to be understood before the cycle is complete. Hermes Trismegistus never left the final cycle shrouded in absolute mystery. He was direct on one essential point. When the world enters its closing phase, the role of the individual becomes more important than at any other moment in history. Not because he can save the collective, but because he can save his own consciousness. And in doing so, he profoundly alters the way he traverses the cycle. The most common mistake is waiting for external solutions. Better systems, more lucid leaders, global changes. Hermes taught that this always fails in the final cycle, because the collapse doesn't happen outside first. It happens inside. It's the mind that loses its axis, meaning, and direction, and no external structure can compensate for a misaligned consciousness. Therefore, the Hermetic action plan begins with something simple yet profound: regaining control of one's own mind, not controlling thoughts by force, but learning to observe them. Reducing automatic reactions, creating spaces of true silence. Hermes saw silence as a strategic tool, not as an escape. A mind that cannot tolerate silence is already fragmented. In practice, this means establishing daily moments without artificial stimuli. No screens, no information, no noise. A few minutes are enough at first. The goal is not to relax, but to rediscover presence. This is the first act of conscious resistance to the cycle. Where most accelerate, you slow down. Where everyone reacts, you observe. The second step is to reorganize your relationship with time. Hermes taught that time is not the enemy, but a mirror. If it seems oppressive, something within is out of balance. Reducing unnecessary commitments, eliminating excesses, and prioritizing the essential is not a lifestyle choice. It's about vibrational alignment. The less scattered the mind, the more coherent the experience of time becomes. The third step involves the law of correspondence. What you hold internally manifests externally. This requires emotional responsibility. It's not about artificial positivity, but about inner honesty, observing repetitive patterns of fear, anxiety, or anger without justifying them, understanding that unacknowledged emotions become permanent states. Naming what you feel is already an act of transmutation. Hermes taught that what is brought to consciousness loses its destructive power. What remains unconscious governs. Therefore, writing, reflecting on, and reviewing one's daily reactions is part of the process. Ask yourself, is this an automatic response or a conscious choice? This simple question alters the relationship with the cycle. The fourth step is to reduce dependence on external validation. In the final cycle, identity is constantly attacked because it was built externally. Likes, approval, comparison, performance. Hermes warned that an external identity collapses along with the structures that support it. Building internal identity is an act of conscious survival. This means acting in accordance with clear values, even when there is no recognition. Maintaining consistency between thought, speech, and action. The law of cause and effect never fails. Coherent mind creates more stable realities, even in unstable times. Those who live in internal contradiction suffer more from external collapse. The fifth step is to accept impermanence without cynicism. Hermes never preached attachment or denial. He taught understanding. Everything that is born transforms. Resisting this generates suffering. Accepting it generates lucidity. This doesn't mean giving up on life, but abandoning illusions of absolute control. The final cycle tests exactly this point. In practice, this involves gradually letting go of old narratives about success, happiness, and security. Honestly asking yourself, does this still make sense, or am I repeating it out of habit? The cycle forces this revision. Those who anticipate it suffer less. The sixth step is to transform knowledge into daily practice. Hermes didn't value the accumulation of ideas, but their incorporation. Understanding universal laws is useless if your routine remains misaligned. Small, sustained changes have more power than grand intentions that aren't put into practice. Sleeping better, eating mindfully, speaking less and listening more, reducing excesses. All of this alters your internal vibration. The seventh step is recognizing that consciously navigating the cycle may generate temporary loneliness. Not everyone will understand your choices. Hermes warned that lucidity in times of confusion is uncomfortable, but this loneliness is not isolation, it is alignment, and it passes as consciousness stabilizes. The eighth step is to maintain constant internal vigilance. The final cycle doesn't end quickly, it extends. There will be relapses, distractions, and moments of doubt. That's part of it. Hermes taught that constancy overcomes intensity. Returning to your center whenever you feel scattered is more important than never straying from it. The ninth step is understanding that your transformation is not just personal. By the law of vibration, an aligned mind silently influences the surrounding environment, not through words, but through presence. Calmer, more lucid, and coherent people stabilize spaces. This is the true impact in the final cycle, and then we arrive at the most profound point. Hermes Trismegistus never promised that the final cycle would be easy. He promised that it would be revelatory. What you truly are appears when the forms fall away. The collapse doesn't ask who you appear to be. It reveals who you have become. The final cycle is not the end of humanity. It is the end of comfortable unconsciousness. For some, this will be experienced as chaos, for others as initiation. The difference lies not in the world, but in the mind that traverses it. Now, the question is no longer philosophical. It's practical. What will you do with this understanding? Will you continue reacting like everyone else, or will you choose to consciously navigate the cycle? If this content has sparked something in you, don't ignore it. Reflect on it, apply it, observe it. And if you want to deepen this journey, subscribe to the channel. Like this video so it reaches other people who may also feel that something needs to change. And if you wish, share your questions, reflections, or personal experiences in the comments. You can do this anonymously. This space exists for those who choose to go through the awakened cycle. The cycle is in motion. Consciousness is the choice.